Have you ever believed that a moment of injustice could transform an entire life? That a seemingly small act could ignite a wave of change touching millions? This is the story of Helen, a woman who once felt powerless in a parking lot but rose to turn her pain into strength. From a public insult, she sparked a movement that reshaped how an entire nation views the rights and inclusion of people with disabilities. Helen's journey is not just the tale of one individual. It is a symbol of resilience, compassion, and an unyielding determination to change what seems unchangeable. Join us as we explore how one woman proved that even in the darkest moments, we can rise, illuminate the path toward justice, and make the world a better place. Step into this deeply moving and inspiring story to discover the true power of human will. The summer sun cast a golden glow over the bustling parking lot of Meadowbrook Mall. Cars wove around each other in a tense, mechanical ballet, each driver vying for the closest available space. A silver Honda Civic glided smoothly into a handicap-designated spot near the entrance. The car door opened, and a frail yet determined arm reached out for a cane. Helen Carter, 63, stepped out with a calm composure forged by years of resilience. Her short, neatly cropped salt and pepper hair framed kind blue eyes that held a quiet joy. Today, her arthritis wasn't flaring up, and she'd secured a convenient parking spot. With her trusty cane, she walked slowly but steadily toward the mall's main entrance. Today's agenda was simple: pick up her prescription at the pharmacy and treat herself to a new book from the quaint bookstore inside the mall. These small victories brought her immeasurable satisfaction, a reminder that even amid the challenges of living with a disability for over a decade, life could still offer moments of delight. As Helen approached the automatic glass doors, a firm, commanding voice rang out behind her. "Stop right there." Startled, she turned to see a police officer striding quickly toward her. He was young, tall, with closely cropped black hair and an air of authority etched into his sharp features. "Is there a problem, officer?" Helen asked, keeping her voice steady, though unease crept into her chest. The officer's name tag read Ryan Ellis, and his scrutinizing gaze lingered on her cane. "Ma'am, are you aware you parked in a handicap space?" he asked, his tone devoid of warmth. Helen frowned, her voice tinged with confusion. "Of course I am. I have a handicap permit. It's hanging on my rearview mirror." Ryan's expression remained unyielding. "I'll need to see your ID and proof of your disability." The demand struck Helen like a blow. In all her years of navigating life with a disability, she had never been interrogated like this. "I haven't done anything wrong," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and hurt. "My permit is clearly displayed. I'm not required to carry proof of my disability." Ryan didn't back down. "If you can't provide evidence, I'll have to ask you to move your vehicle." Helen took a deep breath, striving to keep her composure. "I will not move my car. I have every right to park there. This is harassment." Their tense exchange began to draw the attention of passers-by. A small crowd started to gather, their curious eyes fixed on the unfolding confrontation. Ryan reached for his radio. "I need backup at the Meadowbrook Mall parking lot." Non-compliant subject. Helen's heart raced. How had things escalated to this? She was a retired teacher, a law-abiding citizen who had never faced trouble like this. Yet here she was, being treated as if she were a criminal. "Please, officer." Helen tried again, her voice shaking now. "This is just a misunderstanding." But Ryan was unmoved. A second patrol car arrived, and a female officer stepped out. The murmurs of the onlookers grew louder as the two officers approached Helen. "Ma'am," the female officer said coolly, "we're going to need you to leave this space voluntarily, or we'll have to take further action." Helen could feel the weight of injustice pressing down on her, but instead of panicking, she resolved to do something no one expected. "I'd be happy to show you my disabled parking permit if it helps," Helen Carter said, her voice straining to remain calm. But Officer Ryan Ellis didn't seem to waver in the slightest. As the flashing lights of a second police car illuminated the parking lot, Helen felt the tension thickening in the air. Ryan turned back to her, his tone clipped. "Ma'am, put the cane down and place your hands behind your back." You are under arrest for fraudulently using a disabled parking space and failing to comply with police instructions." The world around Helen seemed to tilt. She felt the cold metal cuffs snap tightly around her wrists. Her cane, a hard-won symbol of independence, fell to the ground, leaving her unsteady. Tears welled up, a mixture of fear, humiliation, and disbelief. Ryan began to read her rights, each word cutting deeply into her dignity. Out of the corner of her eye, Helen noticed a young woman in the gathering crowd, holding up a phone to record the entire ordeal. She was led to the waiting police car. As the heavy door slammed shut, Helen closed her eyes, overwhelmed by a deep sense of regret. How had a simple trip to the pharmacy turned into the worst day of her life? Inside the police station, the harsh fluorescent lights cast an unforgiving glow on Helen's pale face. She sat on a cold plastic chair, the weight of captivity bearing down on her shoulders. Ryan Ellis stood at a nearby desk, methodically filling out paperwork, occasionally casting glances in her direction. Though the cuffs had been removed, the lingering sensation of confinement stayed with her, like a scar etched into her soul. In her mind, questions swirled relentlessly. Why is this happening to me? What did I do wrong? What will my neighbors think? What about my family? Amid the rising tide of humiliation, a flicker of anger began to burn within Helen. This is wrong. I've done nothing wrong. The sound of hurried footsteps broke through her thoughts. A middle-aged man in a sharp suit entered the room, his demeanor exuding both determination and compassion. "Helen Carter?" he asked, his voice firm yet gentle as he approached her. Helen nodded, her confusion evident as she looked up at the stranger. "I'm Michael Grant, an attorney from the Disability Rights Legal Center. We received a call about your situation, and I'm here to help." A warm wave of relief washed over Helen. "Oh, thank God," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't understand what's happening. I've never been in trouble with the law before." Michael knelt beside her, his eyes locking with hers in a steady, reassuring gaze. "Don't worry, Helen. What happened to you is entirely unjust. We're going to make this right." Helen could hardly believe what she was hearing. Just months ago, she had been handcuffed in a parking lot. Now, she was contributing to policies that could transform the lives of millions. The discussion was not without challenges. Some police representatives voiced concerns about the cost and time required for additional training, while others worried about potential misuse of disability parking permits. Helen listened intently, her patience and ability to mediate shining through. When it was her turn to speak, she leaned forward, her voice calm but resolute. "I understand the concerns raised here today," she began. "But we must remember that every time a person with a disability is mistreated or misunderstood by law enforcement, it represents a failure of our system. Every time someone feels humiliated or criminalized for using accommodations they need, we harm the ideals we hold as a society." She paused, her eyes scanning the room before continuing. "This isn't about assigning blame. It's about understanding, educating, and doing better. The cost of training pales in comparison to the cost of continued discrimination and the erosion of trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve." Helen's words lingered in the air, and it seemed they had shifted the tone of the room. By the end of the meeting, a tentative agreement was reached to move forward with the bill, incorporating adjustments to address the concerns raised. As Helen left the Capitol building that day, she felt a profound sense of accomplishment. But she knew this was just one step in a long journey. There was still much work to be done, and she remained steadfast in her commitment. Back in Meadowbrook, changes were already underway. Under the close watch of the public, the police department launched a new training program focused on disability awareness. Officers, including Ryan Ellis, who had been on administrative leave since the incident, completed extensive sensitivity training and counseling. To Helen's surprise, Ryan Ellis reached out through Michael Grant, requesting a meeting on a chilly November afternoon. Helen sat across from Officer Ellis in a quiet corner of a local cafe. The young officer looked markedly different from the stern, authoritative figure she remembered from that fateful day. His shoulders were slumped, and his eyes carried a mix of shame and earnest determination. "Mrs. Helen," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, I want to apologize for what happened that day. I made assumptions and acted without thinking. The suffocating tension in the air made Helen acutely aware of his effort. I've spent the past months reflecting on my actions and learning about invisible disabilities. I know words can't undo what happened, but I want you to know that I'm committed to doing better, Ryan Ellis said, his voice steady but his eyes earnest, carrying a depth of remorse that was hard to ignore. Helen studied him, sensing the sincerity behind his words. The weight of his regret was palpable in his posture, though she had every reason to remain furious and reject his apology outright. She saw an opportunity to transform an adversary into an ally within the police force. What happened that day was deeply traumatic for me, she began, her voice gentle yet firm. It shook my faith in the very systems we rely on to protect us. But I can see that you're genuinely trying to learn and grow from this experience. She paused, took a sip of her tea as she gathered her thoughts, and then continued. I accept your apology. More importantly, I want to know what you plan to do with this experience to make a difference in your future work. Ryan met her gaze, his expression resolute. I'm working with the department to improve our training programs, he said. I've even started a support group where officers can discuss challenging situations and learn from each other. I hope you'd be willing to speak to our next class of recruits about your experience and perspective. Helen was taken aback by his request. The idea of standing before a room full of police officers filled her with trepidation. But she also recognized the transformative potential of such an opportunity. I think that could be a very valuable opportunity, Officer Ellis, she replied with a nod. Let's work together to ensure that what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else. She felt a sense of relief, as if a heavy burden had been lifted. This meeting wasn't just about forgiveness. It was a step toward turning her painful experience into a catalyst for growth and change. In the following weeks, Helen stood before a room of new police recruits, sharing her story and answering their questions. The experience was both challenging and rewarding. She observed how their initial discomfort gave way to understanding as her words resonated with them. These recruits grappled with the complexities of law enforcement, and within this diverse group of officers, her shared lessons were shaping a generation that would approach their duties with greater empathy and awareness. As winter settled over Meadowbrook, the Helen Act continued to make progress through the legislative process. Helen frequently traveled to the state capitol to testify before committees and meet with lawmakers. One snowy evening, while reviewing her notes by the fireplace for an upcoming testimony, she received an unexpected call. It was from a national disability rights organization. We've been following your work, Mrs. Helen, the organizer said, her voice brimming with admiration. Your story and advocacy have inspired people across the country. We would be honored if you could share your experiences with our ERS members. Helen felt a mix of excitement and apprehension. Speaking at a national conference was a world away from her days as a high school English teacher, but she also understood the significance of this opportunity. It would be an honor, she replied, her voice steady despite the flutter of nerves in her chest. Thank you for this opportunity, Helen added calmly, even as her mind raced with anticipation. As she hung up the phone, Helen's gaze fell on the cane leaning against the armchair nearby. What had once symbolized limitation and helplessness now felt like a testament to strength and resilience. It had been her constant companion, steadying her steps through adversity and guiding her toward a new chapter in life. Helen closed her eyes, letting memories flood back. She recalled that day in the parking lot, the day helplessness and humiliation had nearly consumed her. If someone had told her then that from those wounds she would rise to lead statewide police training reform and become a national advocate for disability rights, she would have dismissed it as empty consolation. Yet here she was, defying all expectations. Helen, a retired teacher who once imagined her days would pass in quiet peace, now prepared speeches for lawmakers, crafted police training programs, and soon would address the nation with her story. A small smile formed on her lips as she reflected on the journey, arduous yet profoundly meaningful. Helen knew the road ahead was long, but fear no longer held her. Instead, she felt ready to face every challenge with faith and determination. When spring arrived, bringing renewal and hope. Helen found herself standing on stage in a grand ballroom, facing hundreds of attendees at the National Disability Rights Organization's annual conference. The warm glow of the stage lights enveloped her, imbuing the moment with both comfort and gravity. Adjusting her reading glasses and clearing her throat, she began. A year ago, I never imagined I'd be standing here today, sharing my story with all of you. I was just a retired teacher, living a quiet life. But life often takes turns we never expect, doesn't it? Her voice, calm yet powerful, echoed through the room. Helen recounted the incident in the parking lot, the pain and humiliation she endured. As she described the viral video and the advocacy journey that followed, she noticed sympathetic nods from the audience. Many in the room had faced discrimination, misunderstanding, or unfair judgment because of their disabilities. But my story is not unique. Helen continued, her gaze sweeping the crowd. It's the story of countless individuals with disabilities, especially those with invisible ones. What makes my story significant is not the experience itself, but the opportunity it has given us to drive lasting change. Helen spoke about the Helen Act, which had passed in her state and was under consideration in others. She shared the improvements made to police training programs, developed in partnership with Officer Ryan Ellis, and the positive feedback from the community. Change is possible, but it begins with recognizing each other's humanity. It requires listening to one another's stories, understanding, and standing up for each other's rights. As Helen concluded her speech, the room erupted in applause. Many in the audience rose to their feet, tears streaming down their faces. Their reaction overwhelmed Helen, filling her with renewed energy and conviction. Helen had found her voice, and she was determined to use it to create meaningful change. In the months that followed, Helen's advocacy extended beyond her state. She traveled to other states, speaking at conferences, meeting lawmakers, and collaborating on legislation to protect the rights of people with disabilities. Her inspiring story spread quickly, featured in national magazines and prominent talk shows, drawing public attention to the issue of discrimination against individuals with disabilities. Back in Meadowbrook, the impact of Helen's efforts became increasingly evident. The police department fully implemented the new training program, and reports of positive interactions between officers and individuals with disabilities rose steadily. Officer Ryan Ellis, after a period of suspension, was reinstated and became a leader in community outreach initiatives, focusing on building trust and understanding between law enforcement and vulnerable communities. One warm summer day, nearly a year after the event that had changed her life, Helen returned to the Meadowbrook Shopping Center, parking in the now familiar accessible spot. She couldn't help but reflect on all that had transformed. As she stepped out with her cane, heading toward the entrance, she noticed a young mother struggling to juggle a child in a wheelchair along with an armful of shopping bags. Without hesitation, Helen approached her. "Let me help you with those bags," she offered, her smile warm and reassuring. The young mother looked up, relief evident in her eyes. "Oh, thank you so much," she said gratefully. Helen's smile deepened as she took some of the burden from the woman's hands. A small act of kindness, but one that encapsulated the spirit of her journey: resilience, compassion, and the unwavering commitment to creating a world where everyone could thrive. The three walked together. The mother introduced herself as Sarah, and the young girl in the wheelchair as Emily. Emily, around 10 years old, had bright eyes and a radiant smile. As she looked at Helen, Emily exclaimed, "I know you. At school, my teacher told us about you. You're the woman who made things better for people like me." Helen's throat tightened, her heart swelling with emotion. She knelt slightly, gently touching Emily's hand, and spoke softly, "Yes, my dear, but it's people like you, with your bright smile and strong spirit, who inspire me to keep going." When they reached Sarah's car and began loading the bags into the trunk, Helen's eyes caught sight of a bumper sticker. The words, "Support the Helen Act," stood out proudly. Sarah turned to Helen, her eyes shining with gratitude. "Thank you, not just for helping today, but for everything you've done. You've truly made a difference in our lives." As Sarah and Emily drove away, Helen stood still, Deeply moved by the weight of her impact, a sense of fulfillment and pride washed over her. She had turned a moment of injustice into a catalyst for change. Helen had not only found strength within herself, but had also become a voice for those often forgotten by society. Standing in the very parking lot where it had all begun, Helen reflected on her journey over the past year. The highs and lows, the moments of frustration intertwined with the triumphs, had all been worth it. Now, the cane in her hand no longer symbolized limitations. Instead, it felt like the baton of a conductor, leading an orchestra of change. Helen knew there was still much work to be done, many battles to fight, and countless hearts to reach. But she was ready. She had learned that it was never too late to stand up for what was right, and that anyone, regardless of age or ability, could leave a lasting mark on the world. As she stepped into the bustling mall, a smile crossed her face. Helen understood her journey was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. Later that day, as Helen opened her door to find Officer Ryan Ellis, now Captain Ellis, standing on her porch, she was taken by surprise. In his hands was a vibrant bouquet, and his eyes glimmered with warmth. "Happy birthday, Miss Helen," he said, a friendly smile lighting up his face. "I hope I'm not intruding." Helen smiled, deeply touched by the gesture. "Not at all, Captain. And please, after all these years, just call me Helen." As they sat in Helen's cozy living room, she couldn't help but reflect on their shared journey. Ryan Ellis, once harshly criticized for a moment of poor judgment, had become one of the leading voices for police reform rooted in empathy and understanding. He now spoke frequently at conferences, advocating for building trust between law enforcement and vulnerable communities. Placing the bouquet on the table, Ryan looked at Helen, his eyes sparkling with excitement. "I have some good news to share with you," he said. Helen tilted her head, curious. "What is it, Captain?" Taking a deep breath, Ryan spoke with enthusiasm. "The police academy has just decided to name its new disability awareness training program after you. It's going to be called the Helen Initiative for Inclusive Policing." Helen felt tears welling up, her heart overwhelmed with emotion. "Oh," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I never dared to dream that this could happen. What an extraordinary honor." They sat together, talking for a long while. Helen couldn't help but reflect on the changes she had helped bring about. The Disability Rights Act was now enforced across all 50 states, ensuring that law enforcement agencies received comprehensive disability awareness training. She thought about Emily, the young girl she had met in the parking lot years ago, who had recently written to share that she had started an advocacy group at her high school. She remembered the officers she had spoken with over the years, many of whom had gradually shifted their perspectives and behaviors. Most of all, Helen thought of her younger self, the woman who had once felt powerless and humiliated on that fateful day in the parking lot. She wished she could go back and tell that younger, broken version of herself that the darkest moment of her life would one day ignite profound and positive change. As Ryan stood to leave, he paused at the door, turning back to Helen with a contemplative expression. "You know, Helen," he began, "that day in the parking lot was the biggest mistake of my career. But it also taught me the most important lesson I've ever learned. You showed me, and all of us, that adversity can be turned into opportunity, and ignorance can be replaced with understanding, if we choose to face it with patience and empathy." Helen gently placed her hand on his arm, a warm smile spreading across her face. "All of us have the capacity to learn and grow, Ryan. What matters is that we're willing to do it." After Ryan left, Helen returned to the living room. Her eyes fell on a carefully framed quote on the wall. It was a line from a speech she had given years ago at a national disability rights conference. "Change begins with one voice, one story, one courageous action." Helen sank into her favorite chair, a deep sense of peace and accomplishment settling over her. She had never sought fame or aspired to be a hero. She had simply stood up for what was right, using her voice to shine a light on critical issues. Yet, it was that very courage that had sparked a wave of change, touching countless lives and reshaping policies across the nation. Helen realized that her legacy wasn't just in the laws or programs bearing her name, but in the inspiration she had planted in others. encouraging them to stand up for themselves and their communities, and to strive for a more equitable and inclusive society. As the evening sunset cast a warm glow through the window, Helen closed her eyes, grateful for the unexpected journey that had brought her here. She understood that it was never too late to make a difference. Every voice matters, and the most powerful changes often begin in the most unlikely places, like a parking lot on an ordinary summer day. Helen's story was far from over, but she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them with courage, determination, and compassion. She firmly believed that every person, regardless of age or circumstance, held the power to change the world. Thank you so much for your continued support of the channel. We truly appreciate each and every one of you. During the content creation process, there may have been some small mistakes, and we hope you'll kindly overlook them. Wishing everyone happiness, peace, and good health in life. Stay tuned for more.